I learned the hard way that in healthcare, the quietest job titles carry the sharpest knives because nothing in a clinic moves without credentialing, and nothing in credentialing moves without someone who knows where the bodies are buried in the paperwork. The day it happened, the fluorescent lights in our main waiting room hummed like they were tired too, like even the building wanted to close its eyes. Phones rang at the front desk, the printer chewed through forms, and somewhere down the hall a toddler was having the kind of meltdown that makes strangers stare at their shoes and pretend they can't hear. I was standing near the check-in counter with a stack of provider rosters and a sticky note that said RE Cred, today 5 p.m. in my own handwriting, underlined twice, so I wouldn't let a single distraction erase it from my brain. That note wasn't a reminder exactly. It was a lifeline. It was a warning. It was the date and time that decided whether our entire clinic network could legally bill insurance tomorrow. And I was the person who made sure we could. People love the phrase, healthcare is complicated, as if it's a cute little shrug you do when something doesn't make sense. But complicated is a veil. Under it, everything is simple. If a physician isn't properly credentialed with an insurer, the insurer doesn't pay. If the insurer doesn't pay, the clinic doesn't have cash flow. If the clinic doesn't have cash flow, payroll bounces. If payroll bounces, nurses quit, doctors walk, patients scatter, and the entire place turns into a ghost building with motivational posters peeling off the walls. My job was physician coverage and insurance credentialing. That meant I tracked every doctor's privileges, licenses, NPIs, CQH updates, enrollment packets, recredentialing cycles, and the constant stream of audits that insurers love to spring on you like pop quizzes with the power to starve you. I also managed coverage schedules across 6 sites, because it didn't matter if you had the best doctor in the world if they weren't physically there when a patient showed up. I knew who was on call, who was in surgery, who was sick, who was a liability, who was a genius, who needed a gentle reminder to finish their paperwork, and who needed to be chased like a runaway balloon before their malpractice policy expired. And most importantly, I knew the insurer portals like my own heartbeat. Login credentials. Multi-factor codes. The exact sequence of clicks to submit recredentialing attestation, upload the right documents, and hit finalize before the system locked you out with a cheerful message about processing windows that could last weeks. Everyone else saw it as admin stuff. I saw it as oxygen. I saw it as the line between a functioning medical network and a disaster with a receptionist at the front of it. I'd been doing it long enough that it felt like a private language when I spoke in calm, steady sentences while the rest of the building screamed in emergencies. I stayed late. I came in early. I answered weekend emails because insurers don't care about weekends. And I kept us alive during staffing shortages and leadership turnover and the kind of budget cuts that pretended to be streamlining. So when the new administrator arrived, fresh suit, fresh haircut, fresh smile that didn't touch his eyes, I told myself to be polite, to be professional, to be patient. New leadership always thinks they're going to fix things. New leadership always wants quick wins you can see in a photo. And in a clinic, the easiest thing to photograph is the waiting room. His name was Grant. Of course it was. He had that corporate confidence that comes from never being the person who has to call an insurer and beg. He toured the sites like he was inspecting a hotel chain. He commented on paint colors and chair placement and the size of the magazines. He talked about brand cohesion and patient experience touchpoints. He asked why we still had the old brochures with last year's logo. He said we need to feel premium, like healthcare was a spa service. The first time I met him, he didn't ask about our payer mix or our denial rate or our credentialing backlog. He asked why the ficus plant in the waiting room looked sad. I smiled. I nodded. I kept my hands on my clipboard and my eyes on the deadline that mattered. The recredentialing batch for our biggest commercial payer was due that day at 5 p.m. Not end of business, not by midnight, not sometime today. The portal had a hard cutoff. At 5:01, the submissions went into a queue that could delay approval for months. Months. That kind of delay was fatal. I'd been preparing all week. I had every provider's document scanned and named properly. I had every attestation ready. I had every coverage schedule tweaked because, of course, on deadline day, 2 doctors were suddenly unavailable and one had decided to take a last-minute vacation without checking the schedule. I was juggling it all like I always did, with the quiet knowledge that if I dropped a single ball, nobody would notice until the money stopped. Around noon, Grant called an impromptu walkthrough at our flagship clinic. He didn't call it a meeting. He called it a quick alignment. I should have known that was the phrase people use before they pull a rug. The waiting room was full. Not just full, but the kind of full where every seat is taken and people lean against the walls with that resigned, irritated patience that comes from being sick and tired and trapped. A woman with a bandaged hand was filling out forms on her lap. An elderly man was breathing through pursed lips like each breath cost him. A teenager with a hoodie pulled tight was scrolling on his phone like it was the only thing holding him together. Behind the glass, the front desk staff were moving fast, checking people in, answering calls, apologizing, typing. I was at the side, near the water cooler, because I'd been pulled from my office for this alignment, and I could feel the minutes sliding away from my credentialing window like sand in a cracked jar. Grant stood in the center of the waiting room like it was a stage. He had 2 clipboards in his hands, and a smile that was too bright for a place where people came because they were in pain. He started talking about first impressions. He pointed at the bulletin board and said it looked dated. He said the chairs were too close together and we needed more flow. He said the signage was confusing. He said the front desk looked cluttered. Then he looked at me. Not the staff. Me. And you, he said, loud enough that the people waiting looked up. You're part of the reason the front desk feels chaotic. I blinked, because for a second my brain refused to process the absurdity of being publicly blamed for chaos in a medical clinic. I didn't even work the front desk. I didn't decorate. I didn't choose furniture. I didn't decide how many patients were scheduled per hour. I ran the invisible machinery that made the whole place billable. I'm sorry, I said, because I had to start somewhere, and I kept my voice calm because that's what you do when you've learned that anger gets used against you. Grant waved his clipboard like a judge with a gavel. You keep stacks of paperwork everywhere, he said. You're always running around. Patients see that. It's not the vibe we want. The vibe. I stared at him, and then I glanced at the front desk, where Maria was literally juggling 2 phones and a check-in tablet, and I thought, if he wants vibe, he picked the wrong building. The paperwork is credentialing and coverage, I said, still calm, still professional, even as my pulse started tapping against my throat. It's not optional. Grant's smile tightened. Everything is optional, he said, when you have the right leadership. And then he did it. In the waiting room. In front of patients and staff. He said, I'm going to need you to clear out your office. Effective immediately, we're going in a different direction. The words hit like cold water. For a moment, everything got very sharp. The hum of lights, the beeping from the blood pressure cuff down the hall, the faint smell of sanitizer, the squeak of a stroller wheel, the way Maria's eyes widened behind the glass. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I didn't even flinch. Because when you've been the person keeping a system alive, you learn to let the system speak for you. I took a slow breath and said, You're firing me right now? Grant leaned in, lowering his voice just enough to pretend it was a private conversation while still enjoying the fact that everyone could see it. Yes, he said. For professionalism issues. Office aesthetics. The constant paper piles. We're cleaning this place up. He nodded at the waiting room like he'd just solved healthcare. The air in my chest went quiet, the way it does before a storm. Okay, I said, and I watched his eyebrows lift like he expected begging, a scramble, a negotiation. Grant loved control. He loved performance. He didn't get it. I kept my tone even and said, Before I go, you should know today is the insurance recredentialing deadline. 5 p.m. That's for our largest payer. I have the only login for the portal. Grant's smile flickered. That's not true, he said instantly, because people like him believe reality is negotiable. It is, I said. That portal uses a single credentialing admin account tied to my multi-factor device. I've asked for a backup for 2 years. It was never approved. Grant's jaw tightened like he was chewing on a thought he didn't like. Give it to me, he said, like he was asking for a stapler. I'm not authorized, I said. And since I've just been terminated, I'm not permitted to access insurer systems on behalf of the organization. I watched his eyes narrow. Don't be difficult, he snapped, and the waiting room went a little quieter because people can sense when something ugly is happening, even if they don't know what it is. I kept my face neutral. I'm not being difficult, I said. I'm being compliant. That word landed hard. Compliance. It's a word that can kill a business without raising a voice. Grant looked around, realizing he had an audience, and he tried to soften his tone. We can figure this out, he said, like a man who'd never lost anything important. You'll send the login to IT. I almost laughed, but I didn't. IT can't access it, I said. It's not an internal system. It's the insurer's system. They verify the admin through my identity. If you want it transferred, we have to submit an admin change request. That takes weeks. Grant's nostrils flared. So you're threatening us, he said, loud now for the crowd. I let the silence stretch just a beat. No, I said. I'm telling you what I told the previous administrator every year. If we miss this deadline, claims will deny. Doctors can't bill. The network loses revenue. He scoffed. You're not that important. There it was, the line that always gets people like him in trouble. I looked at him and finally, gently, like you speak to someone who is about to touch a hot stove, I said, in this specific process, yes. I am. Maria's fingers froze on the keyboard behind the glass. A nurse at the hallway entrance paused mid-step, eyes fixed on us like she was watching a car accident form in slow motion. Grant took a breath and tried to regain the moment. Leave, he said, pointing toward the hallway like he could physically push me out with a finger. Now. Security will escort you if necessary. I nodded once. Okay, I said. And I turned, not fast, not dramatic, just steady. I walked down the hallway toward my office while the waiting room buzzed again with whispered confusion, and I felt something strange settle over me, something almost peaceful, because I knew exactly what would happen next. The system doesn't care about ego. The system cares about logins and timestamps and deadlines. In my office, I closed the door gently. I looked at the sticky note again. RE Cred, today 5 p.m. Underlined twice. I sat down at my desk and stared at my computer screen, and for a moment, I could have fixed it. I could have submitted everything. I could have protected them from their own stupidity. I could have done what I'd always done, make sure the building didn't feel the consequences of the decisions made above it. But then I remembered the waiting room. The humiliation. The way he said office aesthetics, like my life's work was a messy desk. The way he used the word vibe while sick people waited for care. The way he fired me in public to establish dominance, like a wolf marking territory. I opened my email and forwarded my credentialing status report to my personal email, because it was mine, it was work I'd done, and I knew I would need receipts if anyone tried to rewrite history. Then I stood up, picked up my framed photo of my mother, grabbed my notebook, and unplugged my phone charger from the wall. I didn't take anything that belonged to them. I didn't sabotage. I didn't delete files. I didn't corrupt data. I simply stopped doing the work I was no longer paid or permitted to do. That's the part people don't understand about malicious compliance. It's not about being malicious. It's about finally letting the rules apply to everyone equally. I walked back toward the front, where Grant was still hovering like a man who wanted applause. Maria avoided my eyes because she was scared, not of me, but of the fallout she could already feel in her bones. Grant watched me approach and said, "Leave your badge." I placed it on the counter. Then, because I'm not cruel, because I care about patients even when leadership doesn't, I leaned slightly toward Maria and said quietly, at 4:30, "Tell him to call the insurer's provider enrollment hotline. He's going to need a miracle." Maria swallowed hard and nodded. Grant heard the whisper anyway. "What did you say?" he demanded. I looked at him and said, "I said you have until 5. Then I walked out the front door. Outside, the air was cold and bright. Cars moved through the parking lot like nothing had happened. The world didn't know a clinic network had just stepped onto a trapdoor. I sat in my car for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, and I watched the building through the windshield. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. I felt like someone who had been holding up a ceiling with her shoulders and had finally been told to move, and now the ceiling would fall on whoever was standing under it. I drove home slowly. I made tea. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop closed, forcing myself not to open it, not to check, not to intervene. Because that was the addiction of being the competent one. You keep fixing things even when fixing them costs you your dignity. At 4:12, my phone rang. Unknown number. I let it ring twice before I answered. "Hello," I said. The voice on the other end was sharp and panicked. It was Grant. "This is Grant Holloway," he said, as if his name was a key that unlocked doors. "We need the login. Now." I looked at the clock on my microwave. 4:12, 48 minutes. I kept my voice calm. "Grant," I said, "I'm no longer employed there." "Stop," he snapped. "This is ridiculous. You can't hold an entire network hostage." I didn't raise my voice. "I'm not holding anything," I said. "I told you the truth in the waiting room. You fired me anyway." He exhaled hard, and I could hear other voices in the background, the frantic murmurs of people who were discovering, too late, that the person they dismissed as paper piles was the person keeping the lights on. "Fine," he said, suddenly softer. "We'll do a severance agreement. We'll pay you for consulting. Just give us the login." I could have taken it. Many people would. But I knew what a consulting agreement would become: constant emergencies, constant blame, endless calls, and when it was over, he'd still tell the story like he fixed it and I was just difficult. I chose something else. "You need to contact the insurer," I said. "Ask them to initiate an admin change. They will tell you the timeline." He hissed, "That takes weeks." "Yes," I said. "That's why I told you the deadline mattered." He lowered his voice into something that tried to sound intimidating. "You realize we can sue you." I felt a small, almost sad smile touch my mouth. "For what?" I asked. "For following policy? For not accessing an insurer portal after being terminated? For not sharing credentials that are tied to my identity? Talk to your legal team. They'll tell you what I'm telling you." There was silence. Then a different voice came on the line, older, more measured. "Dr. Patel, one of our busiest physicians. A good doctor. A man who looked exhausted even when he smiled. Please," he said. "We have patients. We have surgeries. We have payroll. If we can't bill," his voice cracked on the last word, and that was the moment my anger softened into something like grief, because the people who would suffer first were never the people who made the arrogant decisions. "Dr. Patel," I said gently, I warned him. I warned leadership for years. I begged for backup access. They didn't do it. I heard him inhale. "Is there anything you can do?" The question wasn't about the login. It was about control. It was about wanting me to be the safety net again. I closed my eyes. "Not without putting myself at legal risk," I said. "And I can't do that anymore." I heard him swallow. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and then the line clicked back to Grant. "Name your price," Grant said, blunt now, desperate. "Triple," I said before I could stop myself, and then I paused because I wasn't talking about money. I was talking about respect. I was talking about the cost of being the person everyone leans on while pretending you're furniture. Grant said, "What?" "Triple," I repeated, and my voice stayed calm because calm is power when the other person is panicking. "And it won't be a short-term consulting agreement. It would have to be a signed executive role with authority, protected scope, and a written requirement for redundant credentialing access. Otherwise, you'll be right back here next year." Grant laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You think you're getting an executive role here after this?" I let the silence answer him. Then I said, "No, I don't." And I ended the call. At 4:58, my phone rang again. I didn't answer. At 5:03, a text came through from Maria. "Portal locked. Submissions missed." He's screaming. I stared at the message. Outside my window, the sky was turning lavender, the kind of soft evening color that makes you want to wrap up in a blanket. Somewhere across town, a clinic network was entering the kind of financial freefall that doesn't look dramatic on day one, because it starts quietly with denials, with a claim bouncing back, with an insurer saying, "Provider not credentialed," with a billing department shrugging and saying, "We'll resubmit." Then hundreds, then thousands. Then payers freeze reimbursements because of compliance flags. Payroll starts to wobble. Vendors stop extending terms. And within weeks, the administrators who cared about office aesthetics discover that you cannot repaint a waiting room with money you no longer have. I tried to sleep that night, but my brain kept replaying the waiting room scene like a loop. Grant's finger pointing, his voice saying vibe, the sick people watching like I was entertainment between appointments. Around midnight, I finally drifted off, and in my dream I was walking through endless hallways lined with doors labeled Prior AUTH, Payer Enrollment, Audit, Compliance, and every time I opened one, a pile of paper rose like a wave. The next morning, my phone buzzed with emails and missed calls. Not just from the clinic. From other clinics. From recruiters. From physicians who had left our network years ago and still remembered my name because I was the one who got them credentialed faster than anyone else. One message stood out. It was from a woman named Denise at a major hospital system in the region. The subject line said, VP of Credentialing Opportunity Urgent. I stared at it, blinking, because I'd been too tired to imagine anything beyond survival. I opened the email. Denise wrote that they'd heard, through industry channels, about what happened. That their leadership was expanding ambulatory services. That they needed someone who understood credentialing across multiple payers and could build redundancy into the system. That they were tired of losing revenue to preventable administrative failures. Then the sentence that made my throat tighten, we need someone who has already held a network together under pressure. My hands hovered over the keyboard. I could have been cautious. I could have been polite. Instead, I wrote back the truth. I can do it, but only if credentialing is treated as core operations, not clerical. And only if we build backup access from day one. Denise replied within an hour. Agreed, she wrote. Can you meet today? That afternoon, I sat in a glass conference room in a hospital tower that smelled like coffee and clean carpet, and for the first time in years, people asked me the right questions. They asked about payer credentialing timelines, about CQH attestations, about provider enrollment bottlenecks, about denial prevention strategies, about audit readiness, about coverage continuity, about building a credentialing team that wasn't dependent on a single person's brain. They didn't ask about plants. They didn't ask about magazines. They didn't ask about vibe. They asked about revenue integrity, patient access, compliance, sustainability. They asked like they understood that healthcare runs on invisible labor, and they wanted to make it visible, stable, and protected. When we got to compensation, Denise didn't flinch. We're offering triple your current salary, she said, and she slid a sheet of paper across the table like she was offering a blanket to someone who'd been cold for a long time. Triple. I swallowed. I didn't gloat. I didn't brag. I just nodded slowly, because sometimes life hands you a number that feels like an apology for every time you were told you weren't important. I'll accept, I said, with one condition. Denise smiled. Name it. Redundant access, I said. 2 admins for every payer portal. 2 devices. 2 people trained. Always. Denise nodded immediately. Done, she said, like it was obvious. I signed the offer letter the next day. 2 weeks later, I heard what happened to my old clinic network, not through gossip, but through headlines and public notices, because financial collapses leave paper trails too. At first, it was temporary delays. Then it was billing disruptions. Then payers froze reimbursements. Then vendors demanded payment upfront. Then physicians left for systems that could guarantee their billing and their malpractice coverage. Then patients showed up to locked doors and handwritten signs that said closed until further notice. Lawsuits followed like crows. The network tried to blame an employee who withheld access, but their own policies and the time-stamped termination documents betrayed them. The waiting room confrontation became part of the record. Witnesses, staff statements, security footage, and the most brutal truth, it wasn't sabotage. It was negligence. They built a system dependent on one person, treated her like clutter, and then acted shocked when the system collapsed without her. The day I started my new role, I stood in my new office and looked at the empty desk, the clean walls, the quiet hum of a building that ran on purpose, not performance. I pinned a single sticky note to my monitor. Not because I needed the reminder anymore, but because I wanted to remember who I was before I learned my own worth. It said, "Backup access always." And then I smiled, because I had finally stepped into a world where my work wasn't treated like a mess to hide, but like the foundation it had always been. And for the first time in a long time, I let myself exhale, slow and steady, as if I could finally fall asleep without holding an entire network in my hands. My name is Marin, and I keep doctors billable, clinics compliant, and systems alive. And if you're listening to this in bed right now, I want you to remember something soft but true. The people who call you too much are often the ones benefiting from everything you quietly do. If this story helped you unwind, brought you that satisfying sense of justice, or made you feel seen, please like and subscribe, and let Bedtime Threads AI keep you company with more calm, cozy stories where the wrong person learns the lesson the hard way.